Thanks for joining in and welcome to the Six Sigma Green Belt training session. Let me just start this session with my introduction. My name is Amit Jain. I'm a certified Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt and a Lean practitioner. I have been working in the process transformation and Lean Six Sigma domain from past 15 years. And in this particular training program, it's a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt. What we will cover would be primarily one of the methodology within Lean Six Sigma called DMAC, which stands for Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, and Control. So let's go ahead and start. Before we go ahead and start, let's talk a bit about Six Sigma. So you might have heard about Lean and Six Sigma, these terms a lot because these have been becoming quite popular. And if you look at it, Six Sigma professionals are in great demand, primarily because of their ability to make a significant impact on the business, both on the top line and the bottom line, and also provide the value add to the organization. So as I mentioned earlier, in this program, we will cover the 5 phases of one of the most powerful methodology within Lean Six Sigma, which is called DMAC, which starts with the define and ends with the control phase. So what do you think quality is? So we have, three inputs here. One is the level of service, how good a product or a service is, or it's a way of measurement or a medium of measurement. And absolutely, all three of you are absolutely right. It is actually all of these. But if you look at quality, the meaning of quality would differ with respect to the person who's viewing it. So there are different perspectives of quality. So there is one view is from the producer point of view. Somebody who's producing the goods or service, it would mean the conformance to the requirements, which is right product with the optimum cost. But if you look at it from the customer point of view, from the angle of the customer, it would simply mean fit for use. And what a customer want would differ from customer to customer. So for example, for some customer, it may mean easy to use, wherein some it would mean more security. So if a product or service meet the desire of the customer, it would be a good quality product. So let me just try to explain it to you with an example, or let me just ask you a question. For example, if you want to purchase a mobile phone, and let's say your specific need is to make or receive calls. So all you're bothered about is the voice clarity. So let's say you buy a mobile, and even if and when you bought the mobile and when you look at it, you found that your mobile has state-of-the-art camera, it has the greatest internal memory, all the jazzy features in the world that you could think of. But if there is no voice clarity when you're trying to make or take the call, then would you consider it as a good product for you? And as a customer, your primary focus or your basic need was that my mobile should have a good clarity when I'm trying to make a call, good voice clarity.
Then I probably wouldn't pick that phone if that was my main objective, like the main characteristic that I wanted out of a phone. Probably choose something else that may have both.
Absolutely. Right. Great. Thanks. This is exactly what happens because it doesn't matter how many features the manufacturer put in the mobile handset, but if it doesn't meet your specific need as a customer, which is voice clarity when you're trying to make or take the call, for you, it will not be a good quality product. Probably you will not go ahead and buy that product. Right. Quality should always be looked at from the customer perspective. For me as a customer, my need, my need or my desire might be different than your need or desire. So, for me, it might be a good camera, might be the feature that I'm looking at. But for you, it might be the good call quality. So whenever anyone is trying to produce any product or service, they would need to segmentize the customer and then exactly cater to the customer need, give the customer what the customer wants. Now, people have always valued quality. Simply things that are made well, they last longer and fulfill their function much better than the things that aren't made so well. And quality has evolved over a period of time. So let's try and understand how this evolution of quality has taken place. Now, if you go back in time, what you would realize is that for many hundreds of years, quality was matter of hiring the right craftsmen. Some had the knowledge, some had the experience, and others didn't. Some had the right tools to build fast and build well, and others used whatever came to their hand. People used to provide or produce the items one of its kind, and the only way of checking if the item that has been produced is good or not was through inspection. That was the only medium of checking whether the product that has been produced or that has been manufactured is a good quality product or not. So what used to happen is either the producer who produces the item would inspect, or the consumer or the receiver would do the inspection by checking the item. And as I mentioned, inspection was the only mean of checking the quality of the product. And this went on for the good amount of time, and it was working fine till the time the production rate was quite small. And everything that was produced could have been inspected. But with the industrial revolution that took place, and when it reached the stage of mass production, a stage when the production started happening in numbers, they had to produce the same sort of things in multiple. And at that point, inspection of each item or each piece produced became virtually impossible, because it would sometimes take a long time to do the inspection. Then it would actually take to do the production itself. So at this point of time, people started realizing that they need to start worrying about the process as well. So people realized that every process would have some set number of inputs. Now these inputs can be broadly categorized as a controllable input and the non-controllable input. Now these non-controllable inputs are also called the noise. I was talking about the quality and how people started realizing that they need to start looking at the process. And I was talking about the inputs, the controllable inputs and the non-controllable inputs. So for example, if there's a process, and let's say for this particular process, uppercase A, B, and C, these are the inputs. So entire process is all about taking a series of steps and then converting these inputs into the outputs. Now the inputs can be in two form. It can be controllable and the non-controllable as well. So the small a and small b, let's say, are the non-controllable inputs. These non-controllable inputs are generally referred to as noise as well. And the output is largely dependent on these inputs. And due to variation in the input and the process, what happens generally due to the variation in the input and the process, what happens is instead of getting one single output, you would get a distribution, which is output at the different measurement scales, which would really show a variation. So many times what will happen is what is acceptable to the customer is not what is always delivered by the process, which is anything beyond the acceptable range provided by the customer. So there would be certain output of the production which is outside the specification, and it will be something that you cannot sell to the customer. So the variation between these outputs are caused primarily because not all the factors are within your control, because you have certain factors, which are noise and the variation in the process itself. And these factors, they do not exactly, they do not stay exactly where you set them. So all this suggests that the process itself is causing variation. So at this point of time, there was a major question in front of everyone, which was, is there any way I can control the process and I can ensure that most of the production that I'm doing is within the acceptable range, which is a range specified by the customer. So there was a gentleman called Walter A. Stewart, who worked for Western Electricals. He came up with a concept, and what he said that if I observe the output and I collect the data, and depending on what I want to adjust, if I can utilize the data and come back and control these factors, these a factor which is A, B, C, and D that I've depicted here, then Uh, and if I do it quite effectively, it might happen that all my production would turn out to be in the acceptable or within the allowable range that has been given to me by the customer. All this changed, and this entire technique and methodology of studying the data and then taking the feedback from the data and controlling these in process input variable is used in a very special technique called SPC, which is called statistical process control. So what is happening that I'm not just inspecting the product, but I also started looking at the ways to control the process. Now, for a long time, people used the statistical process control for good, somewhere in 1940s and 1950s. By the way, have you heard about Walter A. Stewart, or have you ever seen the control charts? So, he's the guy who is the brain behind the statistical process control and the control charts, which we will cover in this training in detail. What I was saying is, for a long time, people use the statistical process control for good, 1940s and 1950s. But then a question came up: how do you know which factor to control? Whether I should be controlling factor A or factor B, or combination of factor A or factor B. So people started thinking, can we actually go ahead and devise a method where we could say that you can leave factors which does not have much impact on the output and only work on the factor or the combination of factors which have impact on the output. So basically, the ask was to establish some sort of cause and effect relationship. So we would like to find out which of the control factor would have significant impact, or which would have a strong impact, which would have a weak impact. And all this could be found through a technique known as DOE, which is called design of experiment. So then the quality which moved from inspection to SPC, statistical process control, it moved to DOE, design of experiment. Now DOE was a very different way to improve a process. Through this, you would be able to identify the factors and the combination of factors which are making significant impact on the output. Now there was somebody by the name of Genichi Taguchi in Japan. He utilized DOE in a very creative way. What he analyzed and found that almost two-thirds of the process or the problems in the process is due to the design of the process itself. As for him, design was a major culprit. So the focus shifted from the process to the design of the process. Now people started worrying about optimizing the design of the product or the process. They tried to find out which of the design factors were really influencing factors, which of these were the critical ones, and all this could be could be done by utilizing DOE, design of experiment. And this was first done by Genichi Taguchi, and it is known as Taguchi method. In fact, he came up with special type of design, and one of the design is called a robust design. Now, these are the design which hold on to their performance even if there is any hostile environment as well. So so that is how it moved. The quality evolved and moved to Taguchi method. So throughout the time, people came up with all these techniques, but then you can have all these techniques, but we know that we can put things together, things like people, machine, material, etc. But unless there is a proper management system, things will not work out effectively. So people again turned over to the new leaf, and they figured out that we need to have a suitable management system in place. One of the quality management system is called TQM, and there are other systems like ISO 9001. It is also called quality management systems. We heard about ISOs, right? ISO or quality QMS. So these were the systems, that were put together to ensure the sustenance of all these improvement or all these quality tools which were evolved. Now, although these systems do not directly control the quality, but then they provide you with a framework, a guideline at managing system. So if you go through the process of TQM and the steps of ISO, it is given that you will end up with a good product, a good output, or a good customer satisfaction. This is something that consistently comes along if you follow a good management system. Now, many companies started taking this route, and it is still prevalent nowadays as well. You would see a lot of organizations who are ISO 9001 or ISO 20K, which is information security. They are certified on that. So people started putting into practice the various management system. So when people started implementing, when the organizations started implementing it, in many cases, what they started realizing that it did not impact the bottom line of the company, bottom line of the organization. The reason of that was that most of these were sold and presented as philosophies. It was not presented as a process improvement methodology. So what started happening is people started looking out for something which is something that's going to impact the bottom line, which will make the organization earn more dollars or save some, money. That is when Six Sigma came along. And why Six Sigma became popular, because it really had impact on the bottom line, on the dollar, because it is conceived, it is planned, it is implemented and executed in a very special way. Ideally, you cannot start a Six Sigma project unless and until you can foretell the impact of that project on the bottom line, or the savings of that particular project, or the impact of that particular project on the customer satisfaction. Unless you can do that justification, you cannot start a Six Sigma project. And when you are able to complete a project, you would need to go back and assess if I've really reaped that much amount of savings. This is something that is must for every project. And this approach was very different from the TQM, because TQM essentially talked about good practice. It's like for a good health, you need to walk in the morning, but we don't really go back and make the measurement, do we? So TQM was actually packaged and presented like that. Uh, if you do certain things, you will have a good impact on the quality. But people were not able to see those results on the bottom line, and all this changed with Six Sigma. So how Six Sigma is generally implemented in organization is it is launched project by project. It gives a framework on how to select the project, what and which project to select, how do you work out the justification of the project, how do you execute the project, and come back and yes, verify that the results have materialized. And all this is done by Six Sigma. So this is how the quality has evolved from inspection to Six Sigma, where it all started with inspection, and then where we are currently with is Six Sigma nowadays. So this is the overall journey of the quality has been from the past few years. Any question of this? I thought it'll be a good slide to cover before we actually start discussing on Six Sigma. Okay, so what you see on the screen, these are the few gentlemen who contributed a lot on the quality. In fact, the first one that you see, Frederick Goss, he's the one who came out with the concept of normal curve. So within Six Sigma, we do a lot of data analysis, and we do a lot of statistical analysis. And the basis of all this analysis is a concept of normality or a normal curve, which Frederick Goss came out in back in 1777 and 18, around that time. And then Walter A. Stewart, as we talked about, he came out with a concept of the standard deviation, 3 standard deviation from the mean, and the statistical process control. And Dr. Michael J. Harry and Bill Smith, they were working in Motorola, and that is when they formed the entire methodology of Lean Six Sigma. So Lean Six Sigma is a copyright trademark of Motorola Incorporation, and Bill Smith apparently is also called or also known as father of Six Sigma. What happened is since 1800, there have been continuous innovation in the means of production, tools, machine, that resulted in explosive growth of production of goods. And within that, there were many events, many approach, many methods, many tools which got devised. And there are five, in the quality fraternity or in the process improvement fraternity, we talk about the five major events and, within the process improvement framework. The first one, you might have heard about this one, it is called PDCA, Plan, Do, Check and Act. And then there was something that we discussed on statistical process control. There was something by the name of quality circles, then ISOs, then Baldrige criteria for performance excellence. So these two, all these were the milestones of the process improvement culture in the organization. When PDCA came about, people started following the PDCA methodology. Until now, the PDCA is quite popular. If you want to do any process improvement, all you need to do is follow the PDCA methodology, and you would be able to, accomplish the result, and you will be able to achieve the process. But then, how Six Sigma is different from all these is that Six Sigma is a very structured methodology, and it doesn't, it utilizes a lot of data as well. And it has five stages. We can say the five phases of Six Sigma, which is called DMAC. At every stage, you would perform certain activities, and once you are in the control and the last stage of Six Sigma, you would have automatically improved the process that you're trying to improve. So that is what has differentiated Six Sigma from all these other methodologies. And one major factor, or one major differentiator of Six Sigma is that for every project, you would calculate what is the benefit of this particular project to the organization. You would align each and every process improvement effort that you would take to the organizational goal. So unless and until you can do that justification that, I'm doing the project and this is how it is impacting the organizational or the business goal, you would never get approval to undertake that process improvement journey. So that is what has differentiated or popularized Six Sigma as compared to the other methodologies. So Six Sigma, essentially what it is all about, it is this is six is a numeric value 6, and sigma is a sign for standard deviation. So how we calculate Six Sigma, and what is the kind of process we consider, or we say that it is a Six Sigma process. It really depends on the kind of data that we have and the kind of calculation that we do. So Six Sigma primarily is the capability of the process to meet the customer demand or the customer expectation. So in statistically, you can say if your process that you're trying to improve, or that you're trying to measure, if it is creating only 3.4 defect per million opportunity, that means your process is working at a Six Sigma level. So in simple terms, Six Sigma is a statistical concept which represent how much variation is there compared to the customer specification. Okay, so the greater the sigma level, the lesser would be the variation, or the lesser would be the defect that the process would be producing. So for a Six Sigma process, it is 3.4 defect per million opportunity. But as the sigma level decreases, the defect rate would increase. Okay, so this is how you would calculate the sigma level, and in fact, these are what you see on the screen. These are the various levels of sigma. So if you see Six Sigma, it is 3.4 DPMO, defect per million, and just one sigma level down, 5 Sigma, it'll have 233. So, but if you look at the process yield, there isn't too much of difference. So Six Sigma would mean 99.9996% of percentage, right? But at 5 Sigma level, there isn't too much of difference. It is 99.97673. So not much changes in the percentage, right? but in terms of sigma level, there's a 1 point drop already. So to achieve this level, it is very, very difficult. But there are certain processes or certain work areas which work at a greater than Six Sigma level as well. So if you talk about the healthcare industry, the operation theater process, they probably work at 10 to 12 sigma level because they cannot afford 3.4 defect in 1 million operation that they have done. So depending on the process that you're working in, or depending on the industry that you're working in, the level of sigma would vary. But Six Sigma is generally considered a very good standard to be at, irrespective of the industry that you're working in. Only exceptions are the industry which deals with human lives. So there, the sigma level has to be greater than Six Sigma. It has to be 10 to 12 sigma. And there are various uses of Six Sigma. The Six Sigma is used as a problem solving methodology, as a metric, as a philosophy, as a management system as well. So this slide essentially, shows you that there is an inverse relationship between the defects, number of defects which are being produced, and the sigma level. So as I mentioned, earlier, that Six Sigma is actually implemented in the organization through project by project approach. So it involves a lot of support, operating structure, governance mechanism, and generally, if you're trying to implement Six Sigma projects in your organization, there has to be a complete organization structure, defined roles and responsibilities of people working within the Six Sigma organization or Six Sigma department or the process improvement department. Because the unclear goal, less support for a change or a project would mean the project would fail. And there are various reasons, not all the projects within the Six Sigma are successful. If you undertake some projects, there is a great probability that the project might fail. And there are various reasons because of which the project fails. One is one of the most significant reason is a leadership buy-in not there. If there is a leadership buy-in, if leaders are not with you in the process improvement effort that you're trying to undertake, they'll not be able to allocate the resources. You underestimate the effort or the duration of the project that you're trying to improve. If there are scope creeps, if the scope of the project keeps on changing, or if there is lack of involvement of the people in the initiative, then the project is bound to fail. And project scope and leadership buy-in are the two main causes of project failure that we have seen in the past. This is what the entire Six Sigma methodology is all about. So what happens is that you start with a business problem, you convert that business problem into a statistical problem, you convert that statistical problem into a business into a statistical solution, then convert that statistical solution back to business solution, and that's it. That is the entire life cycle of the Six Sigma project. Now, in order for you to convert business problem into a statistical problem, we do a very basic level data analysis, and we start looking at the data and then convert that data, look at the description or characteristics of the data, and we understand what is the problem statistically in a process. And then from there we do a lot of hypothesis or statistical testing to find out the statistical solution, and then convert that statistical solution back to the practical solution. So there's the entire life cycle of Six Sigma or the project. Some difference between the traditional process improvement methods and the Six Sigma process improvement methods. So the traditional improvement is primarily the quality program, wherein Six Sigma is generally a business strategy. So it is said that Six Sigma is generally the top-down approach. Many people from quality department are generally involved in the quality initiatives, but Six Sigma includes everyone, including the management. If you don't have people working on the ground in the Six Sigma projects, the project would not be successful. The traditional process improvement methodologies primarily focus on the defects, and the Six Sigma methodology doesn't only focus on the defect, but focus on where the defects are being created. So it works on elimination of the origin of the defect as well. Other process improvement methodologies are driven by the cost of quality, but Six Sigma is always driven by the VOC, voice of the customer. Voice of the customer is generally the starting point of the Six Sigma project. The focus of Six Sigma is project oriented. So it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is project by project implementation in the organization. So I was talking about Six Sigma. There are two main methodologies within Six Sigma. One is called DMAC, which stands for Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, and Control. Now, this is the most widely used methodology, and this is something that you would use in an existing process that is already existing and it needs improvement, or there is an opportunity to improve an existing process. And the second one is DMA-DV, which stands for Define, Measure, Analyze, Design, and Verify. You would also hear DMA-DOV, so Define, Measure, Analyze, Design, Optimize, and Verify. So it is an improvement system, or an improvement methodology that is generally used when you're trying to develop or design a new process altogether. So these are the two methodologies that we use, and as a part of this curriculum, we would go through the DMAC methodology. This is where the Six Sigma project starts from. It always starts from the customer, voice of the customer. So your project might be, any process improvement project that you do, it might be catering to either the customer requirement or the business requirement, or sometime you would also do a project which would cater to VOE, which is voice of the employees. So the foundation of the Six Sigma would require first to gather the VOC for you. If you are doing the project for the internal customer or that is a business, it will be VOB. If you're doing it for the customer, you can call it a VOC or VOE as well. So the idea is first to understand from the customer their pain area. What is it that the customer is feeling? Remember, we talked about what is quality, and then we said that we need to always look at the customer need. What is it that the customer wants? So that's the reason why any Six Sigma or lean or Six Sigma project that we would undertake, it will always start with the VOC, which is voice of the customer. I'll go through some of these slides, and then we will get into some discussion and some of the tools, especially the first one, VOC. How do we gather it, and how do we convert that voice of the customer into something which we can later on use in the project? The overall Six Sigma methodology is based on y equal to function of x, x1, x2 till xn, where y is a dependent variable. You cannot make any changes on the y, because y is the output. What you would work on are the causes or the problem or the controllable factor, which are generally called x. So whenever you initiate a Six Sigma project, the verbiage of the problem area, it is generally known as project Y. And all the factors which are contributing to the project Y are known as the X's. So it is said to get the result, we should not focus on Y, rather we should focus on all these X's. And Y is equal to Fx is called a transfer function, which actually is a mathematical relationship between the output and the input in a project. Okay, we'll talk about DMAC, and then we'll get into some exercise. So DMAC, as I mentioned, these are the 5 important phases in Six Sigma, out of which the first one, which is defined, it is said that it is the most simple, but I consider it as the most critical in any of the project, because it actually involves you defining what exactly the problem or the opportunity is. In this phase, we select a project, we establish the scope of the project, we quantify the benefit, which is the return on investment of the project, and it includes both the tangible as well as the non-tangible gains. We get it signed off from the project champion, and finally kick off the project. We put together the project teams and everything that will help us to drive the project. Once we have finished the define phase, we will get into the measure phase, which is all about what is it that we want to improve. How do we establish the best way to measure the data? We then take decision if we can trust the output. All this is done by performing a few steps, which are mapping the as-is process, defining the unit, the opportunity, understanding the data characteristics, doing the sampling, baselining the current performance, and all that. And once we have done all that, we take a very important step in the project, which is called the MSA, Measurement System Analysis, and we'll talk about MSA when we will get into the measure phase. Once we are done with measure, we'll get into analyze. It is here in analyze, we will identify the factors, the potential factors which might be contributing to the problem. And then we will validate these factors statistically, and we will ascertain how good the process needs to be. So there are few activities that we would generally perform in analyze phase. We would collect the data, we would establish the process improvement targets, we would review the financial benefit, we will do the statistical testing, we'll do a lot of brainstorming within the team to identify what are the potential X's, potential causes, and the net result or the end result of analyze phase would be that we would have the list of causes which are significantly impacting my project Y. Then we'll enter the improve phase. The vital causes that we have identified and we have segregated from the trivial many, we will then try to put together the solutions on those causes. And then, while we have put the solution, we'll do the risk mitigation, identify the risk of implementation, take a decision whether we'll need to do a pilot in the improve phase or not, and then go ahead and implement the solutions. And then we'll move into the analyze phase, we'll move into the last phase, which is called control phase, where we would talk about the sustainability of the solution. So we would have done the improvement in the improve phase. How do we ensure that the improvement sustain for a long period of time? So it is done in the control phase, and in the control phase we would actually put together the control and the response plan should the solution fail. What is going to be the response plan, who will be responsible to take action, who would be accountable for that. And we would also utilize the SPC, statistical process control, and the control charts in the control phase. And then finally, at the end of this phase, we would validate, okay, this much is the savings from the project. We would take approval from the project champion and the stakeholders, and then we will hand it over to the delivery teams. In case if we are doing it for some other delivery team, and then we will capture the learnings, and then that is when we will complete the project. And these are the various steps that we will go through within this particular training. Okay, so we'll start with the define phase now. You're good. So all of you interact with the customer directly, right? So whenever we are trying to improve or trying to embark on a Six Sigma journey, any project that we do, the first thing that we look at is first define who is my customer. So customer can be two types. It can be the external customer or the internal customer. Since you are dealing so Charles, yourself and Erlen, generally people within the organization, internal to the organizations, are your customer. And Brittany, in your case, both external as well as internal stakeholders are your customer. So whenever you think about any process improvement, first you need to identify who is the consumer of the output of this process that I'm trying to improve. So once you have identified, then the next step is to go one level down, and then try to establish what exactly do they need. So how you can do that? You can directly speak to the customer, take look at the, probably the feedback that they might have given you in the past, their pain areas that they might have talked about, or probably from your experience, what do you think, the area that needs to be targeted so that eventually their life is going to be easier, and we eventually they would be able to give better product or service to the end customers of the bank, right? So then once we are able to identify, okay, what do they need, one of the most important aspect, and this is what differentiates Six Sigma from other improvement methodology, is that we need to establish how can we measure what the customer need. So it is not only about, we're doing the improvement, it doesn't matter till the time we are able to measure how much is the magnitude of the improvement that we have that we have brought about in the process. So and then we take a decision, how do we provide what they need. But one of the key area, or one of the key aspect to look at the beginning of the project, before we actually start with the Six Sigma project, is to identify the CTQ, which is called critical to quality. So critical to quality is a measurable element, something what the customer need, against which you can put together a number, put together a value, and then at the end you can come back and see, yes, is it achieved or not achieved. So gathering the VOC and working on it is a very simple process. First, as I mentioned, you identify who the customer, ascertain what they need, then find out how you can measure, and then how we can give it to them. So approach towards understanding the VOC can be the first, understand the customer requirement, understand the customer perception, understand the critical feature of the product or service that we are trying to or we have been delivering. So one of the main tasks after the VOC is gathered is to convert it into CTQ. So how do we do that, and how do we define what CTQ is? As I mentioned, CTQ is something which is measurable, something which you can convert into measurable term. So every project that we try to do in the organization should eventually roll up to the business goal or the business CTQ of the organization. So we need to do that alignment, and some of the business goals generally which is there in each and every organization is profitability, cost reduction, productivity improvement, customer satisfaction, so on and so forth. So generally whenever customer would give you any VOC, customer would not give you a very clear statement. Customer statement would be very ambiguous. So it is for you to understand what exactly is customer saying and then convert it into something measurable. So I've tried to give you an example. You would generally get VOC like that: your claim processing is slow and it is never right. Your processes are not working fine. Your turnaround time is pretty low. You would get statements like these. So what they want in this specific example is they want the claim to be processed faster, and they want the claim to be right. Now when you say faster, what do we mean? 1 minute can be faster, 1 second can be faster, 1 day can be faster. So unless and until you put together some measurable or quantifiable parameter against it, it will not become a CTQ. So the moment we say process all claim in 1 to 4 business days, that means it becomes a CTQ now, because you will be able to go back and you'll be able to measure for each and every claim whether it has met the CTQ or not. Process all the claim accurately the first time. So if you are able to calculate the first pass or first time yield, or first pass rights or first time rights, it will become a CTQ. Okay, so VOC, what I'm trying to explain, or the point that I'm trying to make, is that VOC doesn't give us exactly what we need to do. So for example, let's suppose we say that tomorrow we would start the training early, right? And and you don't take a clarification from me how early, right? So it's a VOC that I've given, but Brittany might think, you know, it is 15 minutes early. I might think, I might have thought it is half an hour early. Somebody else might think, you know, folks at um, Electron might think, you know, it is 1 hour early. So unless and until we allocate that numeric value to it, it doesn't become the CTQ. You know, we would not be able to satisfy the customer till the time we know exactly how much early do we need to come. So like this, we need to convert the VOC into CTQ so that we can measure what we are, you know, what we need to target and what we need to achieve. Let me just take you through another one, and then we'll do a quick exercise on this. So one of the way of converting the CTQ VOC into CTQ is through a tool called CTQ tree, or a technique called CTQ tree. So first step is to identify the customer need from the VOC, identify the critical feature or that specification you know that customer wants. Step two is to identify what is the quality driver. Identify a specific quality driver from that VOC. And then third is what is the performance requirement. You know, something which is specific, which is actionable and measurable metric for each and every quality driver, which is again coming out from the VOC. Just to give you further example on this. So let's say Terry is launching a store for baby clothing, and after some research with a potential customer, she identifies the exceptional customer service as a critical need. So she uses a CTQ tree to create a list of measurable performance requirement. So the VOC, which is on extreme left hand side, is the exceptional customer service. So what is the customer requirement? When the customer is saying exceptional customer service, it can mean a quick resolution, it can mean an accurate resolution, or it can mean a courteous service. Okay, quick resolution can be further broken down into, you know, probably a low talk time, low hold time. Accurate resolution can be no need to call back. Courteous service can be probably a high customer satisfaction score. Now low talk time, it is still not CTQ here. The moment you say talk time less than 60 seconds per call, it becomes the CTQ. Now you would be able to measure every call and say, you know, whether it is meeting my CTQ, it is meeting my project Y or not. Similarly, low hold time less than or hold time less than 15 seconds would mean it has become a measurable now. It has become a CTQ. First time resolution greater than 90% again become a CTQ. CSAT score greater than 90% again becomes a CTQ now. So it is very important when we initiate or at the beginning of the project, we understand what is it that the customer want, and then convert that VOC into a CTQ, something which is measurable. Again, another example of CTQ. Let's do a quick CTQ tree exercise. So let's do a quick exercise and let's see if we are able to convert this one, which is it takes too much time to complete the task and I want to save cost. Now, there can be any there can be any customer requirement as per you. What we'll try to do is we'll try to convert this VOC to the till the CTQ stage, till the time we are able to align any measurable metric on that, right? So I have also already done this, you know, as an example. We'll see whether all of us are aligned or not. So let's go over the first one, which is it takes too much time to complete the task. And let's do round robin. Anybody can answer. What do you think the customer requirement is or the theme is?
To complete the task quicker,
Okay.
or the time, like the amount of time it takes.
Right. Amount of time it takes, or probably the cycle time of that process or the task. Okay. What else? Anybody has any other input? Okay. Let's see. Right. Reduce time. Now, what is the customer need? How do we convert that reduced time to exactly, you know, what is it that the customer want?
Well, you could possibly set up a specific timetable so you know how much time you have to work with, so everyone's thought is the same.
So now to reduce time, you know, the next step. So I agree that, you know, you would need to allocate probably a target, a specification for every task. right? But how do we reduce that time? So this is something, what you're talking is probably a CTQ, right, for every task. But let's say, what are the various actions that we can take to then arrive at setting up the specific time for each and every task? Or in order to reduce time, what is the next step that we need to take? So probably, the first one can be probably automate the task. If we are able to automate, customer might mean that, you go ahead and automate. So if you automate, you would be able to reduce time. Then it will not take too much time to complete the task. That can be one of the area. What else?
Sure.
Maybe accuracy as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like you reduce the time, but it still needs to be correct as well. Like the task still has to be completed correctly.
Right. Yes, I agree. But if you look at the customer VOC, customer right now is not at all talking about the quality, right? Not at all talking about the defect. So customer, the customer requirement is that it is taking too much time to complete the task. Probably it might happen that you would have gone back, you would have looked at the data, and you would have seen that, okay, I have completed, but then it's coming back, and then I have to work on it once again. That's going to be separate. That's going to be different. But then here it is only talking, customer is only talking about too much time being taken by the task. Okay, does it make sense? Okay, what else? Another can be probably, reduce the non-valued or, waste from the process, or use of advanced technology, reduction of waste from the process. Okay, so, let's say reduce the waste from the process, or probably automate. How can we convert? It's still not CTQ, right? How can we convert it into CTQ? You allocate a number, numeric value. So probably automate the task to complete in 10 minutes, right? So we have done the automation. We would know exactly, whether task is completed in 10 minutes or not. So once you have identified what is going to be the CTQ, then you go back to the customer. In the projects, you would go back to the customer and you would tell the customer, okay, this is what you told me, and this is what I'm trying to do. Are you okay with that? You take the customer buy-in for this particular CTQ. If customer is okay, then you go ahead and say, okay, that is now you have your target, you have your project CTQ defined, and customer is in sync with what you're trying to do in the process improvement, or what you're trying to do in the project. Okay, let's go through the next one. I want to save cost. What do you think?
Reduce costs.
Reduce cost, absolutely. Right. The next one is important.
Would it be similar as the one above to automate processes?
Yep, probably to automate process, or reduce the number of FTEs, or number of employees working in that particular process. Reduce waste, make the process more efficient. FTEs is a full-time employee, and then reduce FTEs by 10%. You have your project goal now. So you do the project to reduce the number of employees in that process by 10%, or number of hours, manual effort put in by people in that process by 10%. So you have your goal already defined. Okay, so this is one of the way of converting the VOC into CDQ. So what we have covered till now is called a pre-DMAC. Before we would initiate the project, all these are what we do. One of the most important aspect, or one of the most important activity that we would do would be to identify the VOC and then convert that VOC into a CTQ, right? And there are various ways of doing that. We looked at the CTQ tree, and then there is something known as affinity diagram as well, and then there is something known as Kano model as well. See, right now we are discussing all theory, so we want to quickly wrap this up and get into more of statistical, and basically start the DMAC. As in, when we get into DMAC, I think that is when we will start doing some exercises, and the later part of the day we'll get into the measure phase and do some mathematical calculation, which are going to be interesting. Okay, great. So let me just quickly talk you through affinity diagram. Have you worked on affinity diagram anytime in the past? You heard about affinity? It's a great tool, and what it does is it is so. This is how it looks like. It's pretty simple format of affinity, but then what it does is it helps us to organize and present a large amount of data, and this data can be in the form of ideas, it can be in the form of issues, solutions, problems, and it puts into logical categories. So it categorizes based on user perceived relationship and the conceptual framework. So and the final affinity diagram is the relationship between the issue and the category, and these categories are then ranked, and the duplicate issues are then combined to make the simpler overview. So for example, instead of the first header, let's say this is, oh, it's a picture image, so I cannot change it. So instead of first header, it would have been people, right? So anything related with people, would come under this particular header. So what we are trying to do, we are segmentize everything. We are putting it into a logical grouping. And as I said, that's how it looks like. It is the creation of affinity diagram. You can say it's a 5-step process. Step 1 is you would generate the ideas and you would generate the solutions through the brainstorming techniques. And you generally conduct these brainstorming with the project team or the project stakeholder, people who are working in the process. And now these ideas would be then depicted in the chart or in the table, and then they would be grouped based on their relationships. Then you would name the group, and then the affinity would be drawn to depict these ideas. So it helps us to do is to focus the brainstorming session into a particular header where we don't have many ideas. So for example, in the list that you see, the 4th header from if you go from left to right, it has comparatively less number of ideas as compared to others. So you can focus the group in getting more ideas in this area, right? So it will give a bit more structure to the brainstorming exercise that you're trying to do. Okay, so that's affinity diagram, and then we have the Kano model. So Kano model, it has been developed by a famous Japanese quality expert called Naoki Kano, and it is called a model of customer satisfaction. So it analyzes the most relevant attributes to the customer service. So as per this model, primarily there are 3 types of customer needs. You have the basic needs, performance needs, and then you have the delighters. And there's a 4th one, which are the dissatisfiers. I've shared the presentation once again. I hope you're able to see the slide with Kano model on it. There are 3 types of customer needs: the basic, the performance, and the delighters. Now, if you look at this Kano model, it has 2 axes, X and Y axes. Y-X is the satisfaction level, from being very satisfied or satisfaction at the top to dissatisfaction at the bottom. X-axis is the is the performance, how well the need has been executed, from low on the performance or less functional to high functional, or very well executed all the way to the right. So it says there are 3 needs, basic needs, which are the must be's. Now these are the needs, it must be present. If it is not there, customer would be highly dissatisfied. These are the needs, or these are the specifications that customer would not even be bothered to check in the product or the service. It will always be assumed that it will be there. If it is not there, customer would be really angry. But if these are there, it will have no impact on the customer satisfaction level. For example, you have a car, you go and purchase a car, and you would not go ahead and check whether the car has engine or not. It is given, it's assumed that car would have an engine, right? When you go and buy a mobile, you would not go ahead and check whether or ask the shopkeeper whether you can make, or the mobile has a calling facility. It is given. It is a basic need. It is a must be in that particular product. If it is there, you will not be happy, right? You will not be delighted. But then if it is not there, you would be extremely unhappy. Okay. Another example, if you check into a 4-star or a 5-star hotel, you would expect the toilets to be clean and the toilet rolls to be available. If these are there, it will have, it will not have any impact on your satisfaction level. But if these are not there, then you'll be extremely unhappy, wouldn't you? I mean, you would not be happy if any of the product is meeting or has the basic, the must-me's which is supposed to be there in the product. Now, these are the first kind of needs. The second kind of need, as explained by the Kahneman model, is the performance need. It can be simply explained as the more the better, and it is directly proportional to the customer satisfaction level. So, for example, the camera mobile phone, the better the picture quality, the better would be the satisfaction level. The lower the picture quality, the lower would be the satisfaction level, right? The battery life of the mobile phone, the mileage of the car is another example of this. So these are called the performance needs. So the more is there, the more or the happier is you're going to be. The third one is called the delighters. Now, these are the qualities that you as a customer, you're not even expecting, but you received it as a bonus. These are, these are also called the unexpected attribute, or the surprise element, or the exciting or the striking feature of a product. The non-availability of these would not make customer dissatisfied, but if they are present or they are available, it would definitely increase the customer satisfaction level. For example, a mobile phone which is water resistant, um, or imagine you get a mobile phone whose battery doesn't discharge completely ever. You would be extremely delighted. Let's say you go and buy a car, and suddenly the guy comes back and say, you're the lucky customer, you're getting this $1,000 discount. You would be extremely delighted. You were not expecting that, and suddenly you have been given this. And so these are the three kind of customer needs. So what Kano emphasized is that historically, what we have observed is that these needs would jump the categories over time. So what is delighter today will move into the performance need tomorrow, and eventually will become a basic need with time. So, what we're trying to say is what is the excited factor, what is the excitement today will be asked for tomorrow and expected the next day. So, for example, the cameras in the mobile phone, it used to be a delighter earlier. Slowly, it became a performance, and now it has become a basic need. Internet access, the power steering in the car. So, all these are a few examples. There is a constant need to find out the new delighters and innovations, because these delighters would differentiate your product or service for some time before they are copied by all the competitors. Six Sigma, if you look at it, used to be one such delighter for the customer. However, with time, what has happened, it has become a performance need for the customers or the clients, especially in the services domain. And slowly it is moving into the category of the basic or the must-be's. So organizations all across the world, what they do, they spend a lot of money in their innovation cells, and they have the features that they're going to come out in the next 6 months, 1 year down the line already lined up. For example, iPhone, they created that kind of aura in the market, wherein everybody used to wait for the iPhone. But now with the latest model, people are not that excited, because people have already started expecting something new, something out of the box from iPhones. But since they are not getting it, people are not that happy, right? So this is an example of the Kano model. So Kano model can help you to identify what exactly is going to be the basic need of the customer, what is going to be the performance, or what are going to be the delighters for the customer. Okay, so let me just throw the question to you from your respective work area, looking at your customer. What do you think is the basic need for your customer? So, the reason why I was asking you, these is that, you think about it from the customer angle. What are the various delighters that you can give to your customers, right? So that will really, help you to improve the customer satisfaction. And remember, once you start giving the delighters, you would need to carry on with it, because the moment you stop, because delighter today would become a performance need tomorrow, and then it'll become a basic need, and customer would start expecting it the next day, right? So that is always gonna be there, right? So you need to think about the delighters that you're going to give to the customer, and then keep on delighting the customer, keep on working towards what is that value that you can give to the customer, and that is what will differentiate you from the other probably from the other vendors or from the other employees. And this holds true for everything. It is for the customer, or for the internal management, or our stakeholders, or the leadership as well, right? So everything can be actually thought about from the Kano model perspective, and that is how you map the VOCs, and it can help you to map the VOC into critical to quality parameter as well. So that is the Kano model. Next is the QFD, which is called, so we have already done the CTQ. So next is the QFD, which is called quality functional deployment. And there's a great tool, QFD, because it is something that you can not only apply in your project, but in real life, as well as any other work that you're doing in the organization. Because what it does is it helps us to identify all the factors as well, which are critical for the project, for the business, or for the customer, as well as it helps us to identify that what are those what are those solutions, or what are those X's that you can deploy to cater to these attribute of what the customer want. So QFD is called the quality functional deployment, and the basic essence of QFD is what the customer want and how you can give what the customer want to the customer. And then you put together something measurable on it as well, so that you get the CTQ for each and every how as well. So we will do a exercise on QFD so that it is much more clear, but then we'll do it in the improve phase, because this is a tool that is greatly used to find out the solutions as well. So with that, we have covered the pre-DMAC. We will get into the define phase now. Okay, so generally pre-DMAC and define phase is a phase of the training where I hurt my throat the most, because I have to do a lot of talking at this stages. But then once we get into the measure analyze, it is a bit easier on me and bit tough on the participants. So I'm looking forward to getting into the measure phase. That was on a lighter note. So I'll get into the define now. So define is the first step, or the first phase of the DMAC cycle. And in the define phase, you would have, so in the pre-DMAC, you would have already defined who's your customer, what are their requirements, and what what do you need to focus on in the project. You would have identified the CTQ and the project by everything. So now in the define phase, you would put together a team charter. It is actually called a project charter. So that is the first artifact in your Six Sigma project. So project charter is generally created early in the defined stage of DMAC cycle. And this is something that you would refer to throughout the life of the project. It's I would say it's the most important document your team will have for initiating and managing the Six Sigma project. on top of or in addition to providing the direction for the project would also serve as an informal contract between the organization and the Six Sigma team, and between you and the Six Sigma team members as well. So the effective project charter would have a few essential elements. These would be the business case. Business case would explain of why you need to do the project. Then you would have a problem statement and the goal statement, where you would describe the problem, the opportunity, or the objective in a clear, concise, and measurable term. And then you would have the scope, which will, here you will mention the process dimensions, the available resources, what are the areas that you would want to improve, what is out of scope of this particular project, very, very important. And then it'll have the milestone. The milestone would be the key steps and the dates when you would achieve the goal or those particular milestones. And then it can have various other things, it'll have the roles and responsibilities, who all are going to be the people, what are the expectations, what are the responsibilities. It can also have the metrics, what is the primary metric, what is the secondary metric that you will use to measure the success of the project. We'll go through all of these one by one. So let us start with the business case first. So the business case gives the rationale for the project. Why is the project worth doing? It should ideally answer all these questions that you see on the slide. Why is the project worth doing? What are the consequences of not doing it right now? Why is it a priority? Why do I need to do it right now? What are the advantages of doing it right now? How does it fit with the business initiative or the business or the business targets? It is belief, and it is a common belief that most of the project fail because they are not defined properly from the beginning. Some of the examples that you can see on your screen is the customer satisfaction. Some of the example why a project is worth doing. If you get a project which is to improve the customer satisfaction, which is to decrease the defect rate, increase the market share, save the estimated cost, or save the estimated dollars, it will be worth a while to look at these particular projects, right? But generally, when the project is only catering to the cost reduction, you might want to find out a different leading indicator, different metric for the project, not the cost. Cost is always a byproduct of the Six Sigma project, but it should not be the main theme of the project. Main theme should be improving productivity, reduction of defect, reduction of variation, increasing customer satisfaction, and all that stuff. Also, at the beginning of the project, when you have identified, try to do threat versus opportunity matrix. You need to address what is the short-term threat, what is the long-term opportunity, long-term threats of starting this particular project. It will help you to get the buy-in of the project from the leadership team. So that is the first step of the project, which is a business case. Remember, it should always have a background of the project. What is the high-level process that you're trying to improve? Why do you want to do this particular project? What is the magnitude? What will go? I mean, it should give a feeling that the entire world will go wrong. If you don't do this particular project. So it is a sales pitch of the project that you're trying to do. So based on the business case, you will get approval from the leadership. I'll move ahead to the second one, which is the second step in the project charter, which is creation, is defining the problem statement. Without problem statement, it will not be possible to set meaningful goals of the project. Problem statement should make a compelling case for the importance and the urgency of the project, and it should answer the questions that you see on your screen. What is the process? What's wrong? What's the opportunity? When or where does the problem occur? Who's getting impacted? How big is the problem? How is it getting measured? What is the impact? What is the consequence of inaction? And what is the benefit of action? The problem statement should never include the potential cause. the conclusion or the potential solution. See, as a human mind, as a human being, whenever somebody comes to us with a problem, we automatically start thinking about the solution. So Six Sigma stops us to do that. As per Six Sigma philosophy, if you're in define phase, you should only be concerned about defining what you're trying to do. In the measure phase, you should only be concerned about measuring the process. In the analyze phase, you would only analyze, what exactly is contributing to the problem. It is only in the improve phase you would try to start, you try and start thinking about the solutions to the problem. You would not think about the solution before the improve phase. Okay, so that's the reason why even if you have a high level solution in mind, you just keep it in your mind. Don't document in the problem statement, because you might have a solution, but then once you go through the entire phases, you might find 10 different solutions to that particular problem area. Right, so it is always best not to disclose the solution at the beginning of the project. And if you know that you have a solution which you will implement, don't do a Six Sigma project, because if you already know the solution, you go ahead and implement. You don't need to go through the entire DMAC methodology. DMAC is generally applied only when you don't know the solution to a problem. If you know the solution, just go ahead and implement. Okay, so this is a problem statement. Some example, poor example, our customers are highly dissatisfied because of bug in the software. Improved example, more bug to the extent of 50 to 60 are found in the purchase module of the ERP software and less in the sales module, up to 5 only. So I would say there is a lot of variation between the bugs found, and rest of the modules there are no bugs found and it is not fully tested. It is still an improved example. I would not say it is an ideal example, because it can still be a better problem statement. Let me just show you an example of probably a better problem statement. Generally, the poor problem statement is the one that is here on the top. Our customers, and I'm sorry for the typo there, it's our customers are angry with us and late in paying their invoices. This is an example of poor problem statement. Improved problem statement would be in the last 6 months. So it is talking about when 15% of our old customer, which are more than 3-year-old, are over 90 days late in paying our invoices. So here we have quantified as well. The current rate of late payment is up from 5% in 2003 and represent 30% of our outstanding receivable. So we have talked about the magnitude of this problem as well. And this is negatively affecting our operating cash flow. So it is telling the bigger picture, impact and the consequence as well. So if you see the second problem statement, the one down below, it has answered when is a problem occurring, what exactly is the problem, what is the magnitude of the problem, and what is the impact of the problem at the bigger level, or the at the business or the organization level. So you should always refine your problem statement like this, so that everyone knows exactly where the problem is, what the problem is, and it will also help you to formulate the goal statement of your project as well. So move ahead to the goal statement. We all know the acronym SMART. We know SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. So any goal of the project should be SMART. It should start with a verb. Either you want to reduce something, you want to eliminate something, you want to control or increase something. Okay, so ideally it should be sacrosanct with the problem statement. So when you say in the last example, we saw 90% of our old customers are late in paying invoices. So the goal statement would be we want to reduce that 90% down to probably a 50 or a 40 or a 30%. Right, so it'll start with what exactly you have mentioned in the problem, and then what is it that you want to achieve from that particular project. And it should be SMART, so it should be very specific. So from 90 to 30, It is measurable as well, and it is very specific because you are talking only on the old, about the old customers. It is realistic. If you think 30% is something that you would be able to achieve, you go ahead and put that target, and it should be time bound. And I would be able to complete the project within next 3 months or by this date without adversely affecting the quality of the invoices, probably, right? So the goal should be SMART. And I'll move ahead. This is how project charter would look like. We'll not go through this one. We'll go through the project scope. So the project scope, it is, I would say it is one of the most important aspect of the project charter, because the scope would, clearly, uh, it would describe the logical boundaries of the project. And you would have to define what is within the scope of the project, what is within, what is out of scope of the project. If you don't do the scoping correctly, you might run the project for n number of years, and you would probably never be able to complete it, because generally, if you don't define the scope and if you don't define the outer scope of the project, there might be some changes in the environmental factor, and which, and because of which you will never be able to complete the project. I'll give you an example as something, a real time, something that happened with me. Some years back, when I got into Six Sigma domain, and I was working on one of the improvement project, and I was working for one of the IT organization. And the project that we undertook, the project why was that we wanted to reduce the incident count for a particular uh, application group by 40%. Now it had 8 applications. That particular account had 8 applications, and overall we were getting somewhere about somewhere about 10,000 incidents per month. So when we initiated the project, we started looking at the incident count. We did the scoping and everything. That only these 8 applications we would study the data and everything. So we started the project. The project went on for about 4 months, and eventually we were able to bring down the incident by considerable amount of time. We were able to bring it down to somewhere on the level of about 6,000 incidents per month. But then, the moment we were able to about to close the project, there's something, something changed. What happened is that account, uh, that account onboarded 2 new applications. So instead of supporting 8 applications, now these accounts are started supporting 10 applications. Now, because of the inclusion of 2 new applications which had a big user base, there was a sudden increase in the incident count. It increased by somewhere about 4,000 incidents per month. So only by the inclusion of 2 new applications. Now, because we did not scope it correctly, or we did not put any new inclusion of application as out of scope of this particular project, we couldn't close that project, and we had to run that project again for another 6 months, so that the applications got stabilized. People were able to understand the application. Then we were able to take some corrective action to decrease the incident count for those applications. So unless and if we would have scoped out any new inclusion of application when we have started the project, we would have been easily we would have easily closed that project successfully, because the new inclusion of application and the incidents were out of our control. We couldn't do anything about it. So because of one small mistake, we had to run the project additionally, for about 6 months, and we were lucky that there were no new addition. So because we didn't scope out the project clearly, we did not set the boundaries of the project. It led to the project, the scope creep and project continued for a longer period of time. So it is very important for us whenever we are starting a project to scope the project in a very, very effective manner. We need to think about all the areas that we can. One of the best way to scope the project is to map the project at a very high level, and then see what are the boundaries of the project that we want to touch with this project improvement. Because remember, you cannot change the entire world with one project. So you need to carefully choose the area that you would want to improve from the Six Sigma project, and then initiate the project. One of the way of scoping is in and out of frame. So it's a visual tool. It's based on the analogy that of a picture frame. So you put in everything that is going to be within, things which are confusing, half in, half out. It can be on the boundaries. Just a different ways of doing the performing the scoping of a project. So I'll not spend too much time into that, and I'll directly move into the milestone. So milestone, typically in a Six Sigma project or a DMAC project, you would have 6 milestones, broad level. It will have one milestone for define, then measure, analyze, improve, and control. The proposed completion date, and then the actual completion date. And within define, you can further break it down. I mean, if you worked on the Gantt chart or the Microsoft projects, wherein you can create the work breakdown structure for the DMAC projects as well. List down each and every activity that you would be performing in each and every stage, each and every phase of the project. What is the timeline that you're going to be performing? You can additionally put in the details like who would be the resources you would be involving within each and every each of those activities as well. So these are the milestones. And then some roles and responsibilities of the people who are involved in the project. The champion would have a role allocated, a black belt, a green belt. There would be a project team. You cannot complete a project without a team. Hence, you need to have, it is very important for you to have the right combination of people in the team. See, as a project lead, you would probably not be able to find out the solution of the project. It is important for you to have the subject matter experts on the team, and especially the people who would be able to influence the implementation of the solution in that particular project. Because eventually, you would have to find out the solution, but the implementation would have to be done by the people on the ground. So you need to get the people who are working on the ground involved in the project. It will serve two purposes. One, you will get good inputs from the people who are right there, do work on the process in and out day on day basis. Second is, you would get automatic buy-in, because when people are involved in the decision making, in the solutioning, there is automatic buy-in, because they would be the one who would influence the implementation of the solution. So probably whenever so Brittany, you talked about the change management, right? Wherein you would want to implement certain areas and you're facing that resistance. That resistance can be X number of factors. It can be because people, it can be because of fear, because people people fear the change, people resist the change because they don't know how the new structure, new process would look like. They are probably not confident on the solution. So it is always better to involve those individuals which you think can be a roadblock in the implementation of solution at the beginning of the project, in the project, and involve those individuals in the solutioning as well. Because if they are involved, you would have a better buy-in, and you would be able to implement the project in a pretty effective manner as well. If we do get the time, I'll share an example of one of the consulting assignment we completed. Very challenging. There was a lot of resistance. People were not really happy to give out ideas as well. And there was a lot of people fighting among each other. And we implemented a few techniques, because of which we were able to actually break through and get the buy-in from each and every individual. So if time permit, we'll discuss about that particular case study as well. But this is one of the area that you can probably pick up, wherein you can involve the people who you think would resist the change at the beginning of the project, so that you get automatic buy-in as well. And you would sometimes get great inputs from those individuals, because they are able to see some of the areas that we would have missed out. So there's one such thing that you can implement within the change management that you're trying to do. Okay, then executive leadership. It is said not all the Six Sigma deployments are driven by the top from the top by executive leadership. And I'll tell you, not all is not a right statement. None of the Six Sigma deployments are driven from the top by executive leadership. The data is clear. So these deployments are driven by the executive management, people who are working on the ground, middle management who are very close to the process. So involve those people in the decision making. It will develop the accountability as well. If you make them responsible, you make them accountable, get their contribution as well, because it is very important. You might be able to find out very breakthrough and innovative out of the box solution, but if the team who is to implement those solution is not willing to implement, the project can never be successful. So you need to ensure that you take care of the people management and the change management aspect of it from the beginning of the project, and you plan for it during the team formation and the project charter stage. Okay, some roles of champion, master black belt, black belt. So I'll give you at a very high level. Champion is someone, champion is one of the most important stakeholder of a project, because champion would generally be the process owner who would provide the guidance to the black belt, but somebody who would own the project selection, somebody who would be a decision making authority, influencer in the project, be somebody who can allocate the resources, remove the roadblock from the project. You need to get champion buy-in from the beginning of the project. Ultimately, you're doing a project to cater to the champions problem area. Then you might have a master black belt or a black belt, or you might not have somebody in this role, depending on the structure of Lean Six Sigma in your organization. So MBB is going to be somebody who would provide the training, on-site mentoring. Generally, MBBs would be involved in the black belt projects, and they would mentor the black belts in Six Sigma implementation. Then you might have a black belt who would support the green belts, especially in terms of statistical analysis, and collaborate with the teams, remove the roadblock from that the project might face, and then give the technical support to the project and the green belt. Green belt would be somebody who would be well versed with the definition, measurement of critical process, generally would be the project lead. Depending on organization to organization, some organization green belts are somebody who's working in the existing process area. So people who are working in the process would undertake the green belt project to improve their process areas. Somebody who would apply the basic tools, and then somebody who would choose the team and lead the team in data collection, solutioning, and implementation of the solution. Then one of the communication tool that we have is called ARMI, ARMI. Generally, the communication model that you use within the organization. So there are various things. You have ARMI, you have RACI charts. So one of the mechanism or one of the ways of establishing a communication mechanism, and this we can probably utilize this model, ARMI, ARMI model, where A stands for the. So generally we use within the communication plan of Six Sigma at the beginning of the project, where we lay down and where we define exactly who all would be involved in the project, what is going to be their role in the project. So A stands for approver. So approver is somebody who would approve the team decision outside their authority. So approver would generally be the sponsor or the business leader. R stand for resource of the team. So resource would be, somebody whose expertise or skills you would need on an ad hoc basis. Then M would be the member of the team, and then I would be somebody who's not part of the team, but as an interested party, you would want to keep this individual informed on the direction, the fighting of the project, because this party can later on make or break the project. He or she might come up with something that you would have not thought of, or you would have not catered to in the project. And this person can also provide you the support in case if you get somewhere. So you would define who all are these individuals, what are the communication mechanism, how would you communicate, what is the frequency of the communication. So it can be email, it can be meetings. For members or resource, what is the amount of time which is going to be required for them in the project? What are the various activities where you would need their support, or where you would need their involvement? For example, for members, you can say that you would need their involvement in brainstorming, in data collection, in implementation of the solution. For resource as well, it can be probably on the implementation of the solution, or in the brainstorming for solution, you would require their support. So one of the way of putting together the communication mechanism. And then it's one of the checklists called GRPI checklist. This tool is based on the simple model of team formation. So what it does is, it challenges team to think about the goals, the role, the process, and the interpersonal relationship. So it is kind of a team activity, that they put together, which can help us eventually in our Six Sigma project. And this is how the checklist can be put together. So I'll not go through this in detail. You can just go through it. Pretty self-explanatory. You have goals, you have roles, process, and interpersonal, and then the rating from 1 to 5. And then we'll come on to the QFD.